Congresswoman Nancy Mace says she's gotten a lot done in just 50 days in office. I talked one-on-one with her for this edition of Quintin's Close-Ups. And if you haven't already, subscribe to my YouTube channel and like Quintin's Close-Ups on Facebook.
Congresswoman Nancy Mace, welcome back to the award-winning Quintin's Close-Ups.
Thank you again, as always, Quintin, for having me. I appreciate it, and I hope that you're doing well.
Oh, yes, ma'am. Doing great here in Charleston. Let me jump right into it because this is a tweet that you posted a couple of days ago. It says this quote, "Just 50 days in office and my first bill passed the House. I promise you I would work hard, and already we are making a difference. This milestone is all the more important because this bill defends our fundamental right to due process." In a press release, your office says this quote, Congresswoman Nancy Mace, obviously 1st Congressional District, on Wednesday, lauded the House passage of her bipartisan bill to allow federal inmates to communicate, that is, confidentially over email with their attorneys. You said this quote, "Those in federal custody can communicate privately with their lawyers over the phone, through the mail, and in person. Yet the same confidentiality isn't applied to email communications. This COVID-19 pandemic has exacerbated this issue as prisons across the country bars lawyers from visiting their incarcerated clients." You said this too, quote, "We live in a digital world and our laws should be reflected of just that. Our bill brings due process rights to the 21st century, and I'm pleased to see it pass the House with overwhelming bipartisan support," unquote. And I went and read the bill, which is obviously the Effective Assistance of Counsel in the Digital Era Act. House Resolution 546 is a bill sponsored obviously by Representative Hakeem Jeffries, and it was introduced on January 28th this year. Let me ask you this, Congresswoman, did you even have a committee assignment back then?
I can't remember when we had committee assignments back then, when they were assigned. I believe it was probably the end of January. I don't know. But as you know, Quintin, I've done a lot of work in criminal justice and prison reform. I had a prison reform bill as a state lawmaker signed into law last year in the middle of COVID. And so these kinds of issues are important to me personally, regardless of what committees I serve on. And I'm really excited about the committees that I am serving on. But the right to due process is an issue that is important to every American. And in this, we need to modernize it. The fact that email communications aren't protected communications is sort of ludicrous, especially in 2021, especially during COVID. And one of the silver linings that I've had since really the start of this 117th Congress is that because I've been such a strong voice for the GOP, I've had members from both sides reaching out to me and asking me to be the lead Republican sponsor on a number of bills. The first one was for Officer Goodman, a hero on the day of January 6th, and he saved many, many lives. But that was to award him the Congressional Gold Medal. And you're going to see me reach across the aisle and work with Democrats and Republicans to try to get some things done. And I think it's one thing to talk about unity, but to really actually be able to do it and to have folks reaching out to our office and asking us to join together. And I'm doing this in a number of ways. I'm doing this not just on criminal justice issues. I love that piece of legislation, but you'll see me do it on transportation infrastructure. You'll see me do it on VA and defense legislation. You'll see me do it on House oversight. Just last week, I learned about a defense company, Atlantic Diving Supply. And over the last 2 years, for example, they've earned about $6 billion in federal government contracts. And $6 billion is a lot of money. That's not a small business, but we're doing some digging right now, and others have started to do that digging long before us as well. But what we're learning is that company has been awarded 90% of all contracts under the Pentagon designated for small businesses, 90% of all those contracts. And when you look at a company over 2 years making $6 billion, that's not a small business. And those small business contracts are meant to go to minorities and women and other small business owners who are much smaller in size, and we should have a competitive market. And so you're going to see me do this. And in that particular instance, I've drafted a letter to the Secretary of Defense, and you're going to see Republicans and Democrats come together. So I'm really honored that there are folks across both sides of the aisle reaching out and asking to work together.
Now, how many minority and women business contracts have been awarded in the 1st Congressional District since you've taken office?
Oh, you'd have to give me a little more advance notice on that, Quintin. I'd have to do a little bit of research.
Okay, and you talked about January 6th.
Yeah, and I'm happy to, like, if you have like specific data questions that you want us to look up, we're happy to do that for you too.
Sure. On January 6th, when you look back to that to right now, who in your mind is responsible?
Well, obviously, the people who committed those violent acts are responsible, and they should be held to the fullest extent of the law. But since that time, and I talked about this after the 6th, I was there. This was a terrible day in our nation's history, and something I never want to witness again. And I've been a very strong voice since that time about the events that led up to that. And in fact, I've spoken very openly about being threatened online by Republicans in our district. I had someone threaten to shoot me in the days and weeks leading up to January 6th. And that was the impetus for me to go out and apply for my concealed carry permit back in December, because of some of the things I was seeing online and the threats. And that only escalated. And I talked about also having to send my kids home right after swearing in. That afternoon, that evening, I booked a flight for my kids on the first flight home the next day because of the threats that I was receiving online from members of my own party and people in my own district. And it felt unsafe. And I was really worried about the violence that could transpire. So I sent my kids home. And then the night before January 6th, I had someone accost me on the street of DC, someone from the 1st Congressional District, a Republican, who drove up in a caravan. And it didn't matter what I said, Quintin, that they weren't going to believe anything that I said about the events of January 6th and the certification of the electoral process, which was a largely ceremonial vote. And when you look at the Constitution, you understand that, and you read it, you can understand that. But it didn't matter what I said. And then that morning, Quintin, there were 2 pipe bombs, and we didn't know it at the time, but there were 2 pipe bombs planted. One was planted at the Democrat National Headquarters, and one was planted at the Republican National Headquarters. And that morning, like every morning, I walked by the Republican National Headquarters to get into the entrance of my building. And no one knew that was there, unbeknownst, was unwitting. And the number of people whose lives were put in danger that day, it's horrific. And at one point during all of the violence and the insurrection of that day, because we'd been evacuated from our building, trying to get back in, I was stuck in a tunnel. And I was stuck in a tunnel. And 2 weeks later, I read and I come to find out that there were insurrectionists that knew that there were some members stuck in a tunnel under the Capitol, and they were trying to figure out a way to get down there and find us. God knows to do what. And and I wasn't the only member in the tunnels down there, obviously. But one of the members I was with was Congressman Dan Crenshaw, who's a military war hero, former Navy SEAL. And we were lamenting about how dangerous the situation was and how we felt like we were sitting ducks. And then when we were able to get back to our office, we were sheltered in place there for 6 hours. Our offices were locked down. The doors were locked. The shades were drawn. The lights were out. And we had to be quiet for 6 hours. And for 6 hours, all you heard were the sirens of law enforcement and police coming to the rescue, because the only ones between us and the insurrectionists were the Capitol Hill police, and they were outnumbered. And I've been a really strong voice on this issue. I tried really hard to work with members on both sides of the aisle in the hours and days after to make sure that people understood that rhetoric has consequences, and that when we use rhetoric and can encourage violence. And that's what happened that day. And it made it worse because it was on the steps of the Capitol. And one of the silver linings for me that's come out of all of this is that I've had members of the Democratic Party and more tenured members in the Republican Party too reach out to me and ask to work together. And folks know that I'm going to be a strong voice on the issues that I care about and that I believe in and representative of the 1st District. But it's something that no one should ever have to endure. And the images, in fact, when the impeachment went to the Senate and they played a video detailing the events of that day, I couldn't watch all of it. I could only watch about half of it. I couldn't get through the rest of it because I wanted to vomit.
Does the former president's rhetoric have consequences?
I've said that several times since the days of January 6th. Rhetoric does have consequences, absolutely. And it's one of the reasons I've been such a strong voice on the issues and the challenges and the violence that transpired that day.
Now, obviously, let me get back to what you talked about earlier about the bill, obviously.
Mm-hmm.
Let me ask you this.
Quintin, I'm sorry, I've got until I don't have as much time today. Hang on, let me look at my calendar real quick because I think I was scheduled till 4:15, and let me just make sure they don't have something starting right at 4:15 if it's at 4:20, because they book me in 20-minute increments.
Okay.
So, hang on. Okay, I've got until 4:20.
All right, let me just forget the other question. Just go to this. LGBT
I'm on
rights.
these 20-minute Zoom increments.
Okay.
And
No worries.
all throughout the day.
Let me go to the LGBT rights and religious liberty. You said this quote, LGBTQ rights and religious liberties are not mutually exclusive. The quote, the hashtag Fairness for All Act protects both. I'm working hard to reach across the aisle and work together to get things done. But Representative, let me ask you this. Who is infringing on religious rights?
Well, the Equality Act does infringe on the First Amendment rights and religious liberty, and that's protected under the Constitution. And I'm someone who's been pro LGBTQ, and I've been vocal about that. And there are measures. It doesn't have to be partisan. We can find ways to ensure there is absolute equality and do it by working together. And I believe that the Fairness for All Act is a measure that could do that. And my message to everyone that I've started working with in committee and even outside the committee, because I'm working on legislation that doesn't have anything to do with the committees I'm on. I'll be working on legislation within my committees as well. That's primarily what we do when we're in Congress, but is that I am literally willing to work with anyone who's willing to work with me. And I think that's really important. Fairness for all is something that I believe could be more bipartisan than the Equality Act. I believe you can get Republicans and Democrats behind that. And if we're going to talk about unity and coming together and working together, we can't just talk about it, Quintin. We have to do it.
Then why exactly did you vote against the Equality Act?
Because it doesn't have those protections for religious liberty and for religious organizations. That's the primary reason to do that. I think you've got to be able to, it's like HR 1. We have to protect the Constitution, and we have to protect those rights rendered under the Constitution. And the Fairness for All Act is a more constitutional, equitable way of going about and protecting and advocating for LGBTQ rights.
Let me jump right into the HR 1. You said this quote.
I got 1 minute left.
Yeah, let me just jump right into it. If it signs into law, HR 1 will use taxpayers' money to fund politicians' election campaigns, whether they support them or not, legalize ballot harvesting nationwide, toss out the state voter ID laws. You said, I'm voting no, and you went on the video clip to say why. You also said it's unconstitutional, that is. Can you tell the constituents exactly how this is unconstitutional?
Yes, I sure can. So the federal government doesn't have the constitutional authority or power to dictate how elections in the states are run. So secondly, we don't want Nancy Pelosi or members of Congress out of California to tell South Carolina how to run their elections. And a clear example of this, South Carolina has done a tremendous job offering free and fair access to the ballot box and people voting, even through COVID-19. We changed our laws to accommodate the challenges inherent with the pandemic, from anywhere from allowing people to vote 30 days in advance in person or by mail. We had ballot drop-off boxes. We had witness signatures on our absentee ballots. We had voter ID. We did everything that we could to ensure that everybody had the opportunity to have their voices and votes counted, and we did a really good job of that. We did that in a bipartisan way. That was the state legislature that did that. And so the Constitution doesn't allow the federal government to tell states and dictate to the states how to run their elections. And I think it's really important that we have some delineation between the centralized power of the federal government and the rights of states. And states' rights is a really important issue. Federalism is an important issue. It's one of the ways that I advocate for offshore drilling, to being against offshore drilling off South Carolina's coast, is because I believe states should have the right and the ability to say, no, we don't want to do that. And again, another bipartisan way to work on that issue. But it's really important that we recognize federalism and the ability, the right, and the authorities of states to run their elections. And that's something that I think we all need to be consistent on, particularly now more than ever.
Can you just eliminate PACs?
What's that?
Can you eliminate PACs?
PACs? Well, I mean, that's a First Amendment issue, and I believe it's been, decided on in the courts as well. But PAC fundraising cannot be eliminated.
Congresswoman Nancy Mace, thank you for your time, and welcome back to Quintin's Close Ups.
Yes, sir, as always, sir, and thank you so much, Quintin, and you have a great afternoon and weekend.
Thank you.